Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Courtney Wilburn, who is a speaker, writer, and currently a senior engineering manager at Elastic. Courtney joins us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States. Courtney Wilburn, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Oh, wow. I have to say the top thing for me is a good community around it. You know, folks who seem to are enthusiastic about what the thing does. They realize how essential it is to being in the wild, and they want it to stay there. So that's definitely one of the things, like people who are, enthusiastic about whatever it does. And then, just the community, like people who are willing to work toward that goal, whatever those goals are. They have something in mind, and then they're focused on accomplishing those goals.
I'm thinking about community, and like my brain immediately wants to think about like open source context. But do you feel like that's the same within like a private organization and their own software that they're working and maintaining?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, with internal software, if it's something that you're building that is just, if it's a product being made by a company, I think there still has to be a level of interest and passion and an understanding about it, how essential it is to either the end users, if you're not the end users, if you are one of the users of the software that you're maintaining, that you have a desire to see it, be its best version of itself, I guess, or continue to perform well as its demands or use cases change. I think that applies whether or not you're talking about open source software or enterprise software.
Right. It's interesting. I don't think I'd heard anyone kind of quite describe and I don't know how large of teams you might work on, but I never really thought about like the software team or the people that are wanting to see it succeed and prosper and persist or last for a long time. Refer to that as a community. I like that. I like that framing. It's interesting. So within that, what are some characteristics of when there is a community that cares about a piece of software, whether it's internal or public or open source or what have you? But what are some of the sort of characteristics would you likely see in those pieces of software or infrastructure code?
Yeah, I mean, excellent documentation is a part of it. I mean, I think that's the only a lot of the stuff that gets passed down through lore, if you're not necessarily relying on any sort of physical documentation, a lot of that changes over time, and some of it may not hold true from a project's inception to where it currently is. And so, documenting either the changes it's undergone or openly documenting the evolution of that and leaving its entire history for scrutiny, for examination is part of it, or even just saying this is where it is right now and this is how you use it as it lives right now is important. And I think that if something is well documented and people understand what their relationship is to it, whether it's for like a, simple user's documentation or a developer's documentation against that, it's going to continue to live in some way, shape, or form, right? Even if it ends up getting sort of broadly refactored, if you kind of understand why something came to pass and what problems it's attempting to solve, then its DNA will stick around in some way, shape, or form, right? Like it's going to stay around. Like someone will be beholden to that mission more than likely.
When folks are joining an organization where they've had software that's been around for a while, do you feel like you've had a good opportunity as you join organizations to really get to spend a lot of time thinking about how or learning about how things came to be the way they are, or do you feel like you spend more of your time understanding where things are today so you can think about like what's next with it?
I try to spend about 50-50 between those two things. Like I'm one of those folks. I really feel like the having a deep contextual, basis or a framework to sort of analyze what's going on will like helps me a great deal. That may not be the case for everyone else. I think, personally, I kind of want to get as much context, as much background knowledge. I kind of want to, understand, like, are they still solving for this thing? Were they always solving for this thing when they initially built it? Or did they see, like, actually, once we were solving for this, I think about, Slack's origins as like a being related to gaming, and it ended up solving for a completely other use case. Is that the case for the thing that you're working on? Was it an attempt to solve this problem when it actually ended up solving some other problem and doing that well? So how do we approach, how do we, in light of that, how do we continue to add features or build on or adjust to the evolution of the piece of software itself? I think that is as important. Or it helps you figure out if there's another tool entirely that can, that you might need to build to try to solve for that use case. Or should you just lean into you've solved this problem really well, even though you didn't intend to? Let's just keep walking that path kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you use the metaphor technical debt very often in your day-to-day work?
Yes, I do.
And what is your current take on it, or how do you describe it to other people on your teams?
So, I think it really depends on the context in which it's brought up. But, I think that, like, technical debt is, at least for me, when I talk about it, is a result of shifting priorities, in some way or another. Like, either formally or informally, a group of people have decided to take their, the direction of what they're building somewhere. There are some problems, but for whatever reason, this group of people have chosen not to, either formally or informally to address them. And that, to me, is what technical debt is. We've chosen not to address these problems so that we may address these other problems. And then, when it comes to prioritization of those things, do we see an emergent need to address those problems, or do we say we have decided not to address these specific problems because we don't see, either the need has been obviated by another tool, or is it something that we need to reprioritize and start addressing because we're hitting on either a key reason or something that's holding back the progression of this, a positive sort of evolution of this particular piece of software.
I'm curious, you mentioned, things will get prioritized, or maybe they decide that it's not going to happen maybe right now or not. Do you have any patterns that you found? Is this are these types of conversations that happen more real time within your teams to kind of figure things out, or are these things you actually have like a backlog of like technical debt and you're like, we made a decision on this so far, so there's like it's documented somewhere why we're not doing this just yet, or maybe never? Because sometimes I always wonder when people join teams and they encounter these things and they're like, oh, what's this? And then someone's like, oh, we decided not to do that or not. How does this knowledge kind of persist, or these decisions, or when do you revisit them?
I try to make sure it's documented as much as possible, at least for folks that are on my teams. I want to make sure that we're aware of, like, regardless of the size of the sticking point, if it's a sticking point, I want to make sure that people are aware that, either we're aware of it, right? If it's something new that we're encountering, I think it's worth noting as well. But like if it's something that folks are aware of, if it's a known issue that people are encountering, I want to make sure that we've come to a decision. I try to keep that in our conscious focus as much as possible, that we have decided this is not a high enough priority for us to address. Here is a common workaround that we found, and that is documented as well, right? Like this is a workaround for this problem. And then even like a potential expiration date, I think is another thing that we, I don't think we do as great of a job, at least in my own personal history of saying like this has a specific expiration date, but like saying that like, in whatever period of time, or once this other factor becomes more of an issue, we will need to address this. The priority of this may change. It may move forward. We may need to address it, but this is why we've done this now. This is why we've decided not to address this now. We're opening to re-examining that in a very specific period of time to make sure that that is still the case.
I like that approach, or thinking about expiration dates and trying to honor those. I guess is always going to be a little bit of a difficult thing because, like things, we never know what the future is going to look like in terms of where you're at and everything. I'm curious if as you reflect on your understanding of technical debt over the years, has that evolved a little bit? Do you feel like there's a period in your career where you might have, in retrospect, might have been using technical debt as a communication tool for maybe something that you actually wouldn't agree with yourself now that is technical debt?
I don't know. I think I think I've definitely been in places in the past where technical debt is it's just assumed that like there's not necessarily an expiration date. We can just toss this over the fence for a while, or compartmentalize sort of how we're building, or compartmentalize our scope for like how we're building our thing, and pretend like these things of technical debt don't exist. And I feel like, to me, that's kind of like an untended garden, right? At some point, it's going to be overgrown with weeds or poison ivy or whatever. So it makes sense to address it. I feel like my approach to technical debt, I think the only thing that has changed in terms of my approach to technical debt, I have more of a sense of urgency to attempt to pay down some of those things, because I've seen what has happened when there's a failure to at least examine how deep in technical debt a particular project is, and what that can do to the overall health of even just the people involved in the project. I think sometimes if someone hops into, even let's say, an open source project, and they're very much enthusiastic about the technology itself, and then they look over in GitHub and it's got 10,000 open issues, some of which have been open for a number of years. I think sometimes the enthusiasm for making contributions to that, or even noting that there may be issues with that software, will probably wane, right? They're like, well, this is going on top of a pretty substantial heap of things, and who's to say? It looks like there's a possibility it's been addressed. Someone brought it up 3 years ago and it still hasn't been addressed, etc. And I think that I care a lot more now as I've progressed about like some of the people involved in maintaining the software, and what that must be like, and like how much it can take away from the software itself improving. If there are core issues that people continue to note that haven't been addressed, right? Even the people using it are aware of that, and they don't necessarily feel empowered to address these issues in a timely fashion, then that's gonna eventually, you're gonna head down a path of the software itself not necessarily meeting its needs, and meeting anyone's needs, and perhaps hastening the deprecation of the software.
I can appreciate that. And I'm also thinking about my own open source projects, or one in particular that consistently has like 500 plus pull requests. And even though we're like tackling them, it's just like, I'm always like, how does this feel like for someone new to the project that wants to contribute? They're like, oh my gosh, like, are they ever going to we do get to pull requests. It's just that we can't keep up with, consistently getting like several a day, so it's like a capacity thing too. But it's an interesting, but it's like a form of, we have some process debt or something that we're working through.
Yeah, I mean, process debt is like so hard. You know what I mean? I feel like process debt is one of those things. It's just like, trying to figure out that sweet spot of like how you leaving flexibility for people to like start working on bits of the project that are maybe less, directly feel less transactional when it comes to sort of getting the pull request, merging the pull request, making sure it makes sense, even addressing the pull request in whatever way it needs to be addressed, and then even like putting out another release if it requires it. Like, I think balancing like the way, how often people are working with that versus like, working on building out new features is like, that can be a really tough balance to strike. And I think that like people who are contributing to these projects sometimes don't think about the fact that like you can contribute to this 24/7. A lot of the people who are maintaining these projects have probably a limited amount of time and bandwidth through which they can like actually deal with, sort of the onslaught of, in number of pull requests coming in globally, right, on a daily basis, and how difficult that is. I think as I've gotten older too, that's one of the, and progressed through, I started thinking about, that a little bit more, like the human side. Like, is this necessary for me to put a pull request in for this? Like, do I need to be persistent in sort of dealing with this? Like this is something that's been around for a while. B is incredibly stable. C has a very broad, user base. Is this something like, is this something that I can take care of personally rather than like,
I think of like in my example or my scenario where I always like remind myself that it's open source, so people are making customizations that are making features or enhancements that they can benefit immediately from, so they can use their version of it, their fork of the project. It just may not be upstream for a while so that other people can take advantage of it. And if anyone was super curious, if they knew how to do it, they can always pull in those requests into their version and take, so that's one of the nice things about the open source, is that I give myself that a little bit of, be a little okay with myself with not keeping up on everything. Cause like, I don't want to necessarily run the project faster. I don't want to have higher output. It's like, that was never the goal for the thing. So it's just like, anyhow, it's just like something that I navigate. I want to switch gears a little bit and I'll talk a little bit about recruitment if possible. So I know that you work in an environment that's maybe a bit more on the infrastructure side of things than I am. And I'm curious. Well, at least I saw this tweet recently, and someone was talking about how it can be difficult for organizations to bring in junior level infrastructure engineers. And do you feel like that resonates with you? Are you able to recruit junior level people?
It does resonate. It's hard because you're having to balance the demand between like, much like an open source project. I don't see this as like very, very different in my view. Balancing the needs of like some very high priority things that need to get addressed, some mission critical, if you will, problems that need addressing, versus, the amount that you need to pour into someone who is just starting, to give them a solid foundation. Like I certainly, I take hiring and recruiting very seriously, and I'm hiring someone who is very junior. I'm looking for someone who, not just someone who I think, I feel like there's a reciprocal relationship there. There's, I want to be able to learn from them. Like, they're newer to the industry. Their perspective is unique, all of these sorts of things. But I also want to make sure that they have an opportunity to grow. If you can't provide that, I think too, it's good to be honest as an organization that if you can't provide that, then it makes sense to not hire folks who would need that, right? Who would need this level of mentoring, who would need this level of room to grow in a specific way, versus sort of, having sort of very senior hired guns that can come in and speak to and address these very bespoke issues. But you want to make sure that you're hiring for someone who could potentially be around for a long time, right? And the impressions that they get from working with you or working with more senior folks are going to sort of color their impression of the industry, their entire career even, or like, turn them on or off to that specific subdiscipline. So you have to, I think it is essential if you're expecting mentorship and professional development from your senior engineers. I personally feel like you can't do that without having more junior engineers there. They've got to be able to share knowledge and even gain other knowledge from somewhere. That can't happen in a vacuum. And I feel like having junior engineers and having a relationship where they can grow and the other people can continue to grow in different ways from having that relationship is essential to, I think, just general professional development and health of the human beings that are sort of tasked with building this thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. like we get contacted by companies that are looking for like, I work in the consulting side of things. So people will come to us and be like, hey, we need some senior people. They're never asking, hey, can we rent some junior developers to work on our projects? Like they're like, oh, we can easily find junior people, but we just don't have the infrastructure in place to support them. And on the infrastructure side, I think what's interesting about that to me, it's like, it feels like you need to build up a lot of knowledge to be able to do a lot of those types of tasks that might be getting, shared amongst the team or what have you, or maybe the team is already feeling like they've got more than enough things to already be responsible for, to let alone have to also potentially be responsible for providing, carving out time to be a mentor, to help people, navigate some of those things and to build those people up. So I guess my curiosity about that is like, and I feel like this was always a thing that my team was always concerned about for a long time. Like how could we bring in junior people, or even have interns come in? We're like, I don't like, there are senior people like, I don't have time. I got too many things already on my plate. You want me to also be responsible for someone? For us, we eventually were like, all right, let's bring in, we'll try some interns. We'll do this for like 2 months. There's a time box. We're going to do this. They'll go away, and we're not responsible for hiring them. So we set the expectations. We give them 2 months. Let's learn from it. Let's try. So I went up, started to do that on a regular basis to help build up a little bit of mentorship skill sets within the team. Just be like, okay, we could do that for limited amount of time. I don't have to be responsible for them myself for 2 months. We can share the load across multiple people. I'm not trying to say this is what you should do or anything, or other people, but it was like a way for us to start getting more comfortable as an organization with having people come in, and by time boxing it and knowing that this wasn't going to be someone we needed to be responsible for the next several years. But now we're bringing junior people because we already know that. And the junior people that we bring in can also be mentors to the interns that we bring in. So we're always like regularly bringing interns in like every quarter. We have a couple junior people that are able to share their knowledge, and the junior people are working with senior people. Interns work with senior people. And we have people that are now seniors that were once upon a time a junior person, And so it's like, I guess within organizations, where do these senior people come from? How do they even get their foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean, I think with senior people, it's like, they've been junior at some point in their lives, right? Like, everyone has been even if you have an abundance of skill, you come in with an abundance of skill, there's something that you're green about, right? Like you can be the most excellent programmer in a specific language, but if you haven't coded for a specific use case or whatever, or a specific subset of engineering or a specific subset of programming, you're junior there, right? And I think one thing that I try to do, at least for the senior engineers that I'm hiring, is that I'm very clear about baking in mentorship as a responsibility early on. Like that is an expectation. If you're a senior engineer on a team that I'm hiring for, you will be expected to mentor in some capacity as a part of your professional growth. It is incumbent upon you to engage in this, like have a mentorship relationship with someone, and even being mentored by someone it's essential, because there are different ways in which you can kind of walk this path. When it comes to junior folks, I think that just that level of curiosity, especially when they're coming into infrastructure engineering, if they've just generally been an engineer, like I think that's good enough, right? For me, as long as they're curious enough about to stay open-minded, and learn a new approach or a new side of the world, so to speak, that's sufficient. But I think just making sure that is baked in the process early on, right? For a junior, like expect that you will have someone who is shepherding you through, on this journey. And then for a senior engineer, expect to shepherd someone through this journey. That's kind of the approach that I've taken. It's worked pretty well so far. And I think folks have learned a lot from each other, and it's been good. I think I think the beautiful thing that I've seen is, watching people become better at teaching by being a mentor, right? Like losing that headcanon, turning it into actual documentation or code, or into a formal process. It has been a really beautiful thing to see.
We'll be back with our interview with Courtney in just a moment. Hi, it's me. Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Courtney Wilburn. Do you provide any advice or have you felt like you've needed to provide some advice to people on how to give and or receive feedback amongst on a technical level, and whether that be through pull request feedback or just communication between team members?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's, being a pretty good communicator is an essential part of your growth and development. I think a lot of the times, for a long time where there was just a sort of tolerance of, high technical skill, poor communication in order to move a particular project forward. But I think as bits of software mature and as the, divisions of labor, so to speak, that pour into particular project or sets of projects, in order for all of the moving parts to work well together, and even for the people to work well together, communication is key. And sometimes it's been very direct coaching, right? Very, very direct coaching, telling people looking through, you gave this feedback, here are some general pointers about how to give feedback, and when it comes to, receiving feedback, let's have some rules of engagement on how we engage with each other, and then you can examine whether or not you need to, as you grow a comfort in communicating with people, you can sort of figure out what works best to more strictly enforce or more loosely enforce in terms of some of those rules. I think part of that is you have to model that as well, and so as a manager, I'm modeling some of that. One of the things that I've done that has been really helpful for me is, initially if I have taken on a new team, is asking people about ways in which they've received feedback that have been helpful and not helpful to them. And then, figuring out the best ways that they receive information. What's the way that they receive information that's going to resonate the most? If that's around a technical issue, if that's around a performance issue even, what are the ways in which the feedback resonates best with you? And that people are that their teammates are made aware of that here are the best ways for me to receive feedback, to talk about the code in this way, to talk about, things to approach it saying these things, or to say I'm a more visual person, so I would prefer someone to demonstrate it, or I want to read through this thing, or I prefer code comments, or whatever it is. We try to make sure that folks, different styles of learning are at least accommodated to the best of our people's abilities, so that the people can truly internalize the feedback that they're receiving, and that they can understand that if they're giving feedback, perhaps if they, approach it in a different way, it's going to resonate with that person more. They'll be able to take it more, to understand it more, and incorporate it more into sort of future actions.
So one of the things I was really looking forward to digging into with you is related to refactoring. You had mentioned that earlier in terms of think about technical debt type things as well. And when you get a chance your team's going to work on some refactoring. And so firstly, when it comes to say refactoring, like a software applications code base versus say refactoring the infrastructure that maybe the code will exist within, do you see any major differences in how teams might approach those two paths?
I've worked on both sides of the fence. I've worked in both, software and just building pieces of software, building the infrastructure that sits alongside it. And I think the most enlightening thing for me is just was realizing the processes are the same. And essentially, especially when you're sort of, getting to the cloud level, beyond the sort of systems design and all these other sorts of pieces, you have to, approaching a refactor is similar. I think the implementation of the refactor and the implications of a refactor are slightly different, but how you're putting these changes in place are essentially the same. You have to have a specific amount of buy-in, so to speak. Are the reasons why we're doing this? Is it necessary? Is it mission critical? Will it improve things in such a way that it's going to end up sort of saving us time, effort, whatever, user problems in the future, whatever it is. You have to go into that with the same sort of thought about like, what are we doing? What are the reasons why we're doing this? What are our motivations behind this? And they have to typically, they're usually kind of the same, right? We need to make these specific improvements in order to improve performance or delivery or whatever that is. I think when it comes to the implementation of a refactor, like I think obviously when it comes to infrastructure, it's one of those like 1 or 0, right? Like if it falls over, if the whole thing falls over and nothing about this application is like, like it falls over after you like poorly implement a refactor, then that's a huge problem. So you have to sort of you have to think about whether or not this is something that can be done, a lights on, lights off sort of situation, a slow transition into something, a slow migration. Will users notice? All these sorts of things. A lot of those concerns are the same, and I think sometimes people think about the implications of it being a little bit different because the infrastructure is one of those like, the foundation of a house, right? Like, or at least people think of it that way, and that like, if you're messing up an infrastructure change, then it's like nothing works out. But like to me, it's very, very similar. Like obviously, like if you can have fancy, snappy, beautiful infrastructure all day, but if the app's no good, or like it's in need of a lot of upkeep or a large monumental like framework shift or update, then like it's just as problematic as the infrastructure not working, if not worse, right? Like, I think people think about infrastructure the way they do like a utility, essentially, right? Like if you'll know when it's not working, right? When your lights are not working or your water's not running, etc. But yeah, you also know when like the application's not performing in the manner in which you expect it to.
And I mean, I'm guilty of that myself, and thinking of it like that and being like, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this a little bit, because it was just like thinking like, I always feel like they're like a little bit more risk adverse of being like, okay, well, when we make these infrastructure changes, like how are we going to test these things out, make sure we feel really comfortable before we start rolling it out or what have you. And sometimes it's kind of feel like, are there things that, I mean, let's make an assumption. I'm making an assumption. Do you do anything like retrospectives after these rollouts and things like that? And are there common things that tend to pop up that you've since included in, say, a checklist of things that your team tries to think about and answer ahead of time to make sure that like, well, we don't want that to happen again?
Right. I think sometimes, like, I think the major thing that I think about too is sometimes scale. Like, I think with infrastructure changes, like, at least now with cloud computing, it's a little bit easier to attempt to like to approximate how something happens at scale, right? Like how something will perform at scale when it comes to like a particular infrastructure change. But I do think sometimes that can bite you in the butt when you're like testing. You're like, well, this worked and it was like, performant in this way, and you were not necessarily thinking about, what real time common user interactions with like, or like what downstream effects user interactions have on a particular set of infrastructure, and how infrastructure change could positively or negatively impact the performance of the application sitting on top of it. Like, I think that like that's one of the things that like I've definitely learned, like, we should actually like, instead of, from like a pure sort of synthetics testing, like of like performance of a stack, right? On top of a infrastructure, let's try to have some of our test cases for this when we're rolling out a big change. Let's do something that very, very much more closely emulates how people are using this in the wild and what that looks like in its infrastructure, and test against those metrics, right? To make sure that it's going to be successful, or we're going to see improvements in some of these particular things that we're looking for.
That's true. I know that I'm just quickly reminded of a project that we were working on. I think it was maybe late last summer. We were getting ready to move a web application from between two different like platforms, and when we're doing a little bit of testing in the new platform, we're thinking like, oh, we're not going to have to make any major code changes, but it was going to help us set us up so we could do some upgrades in the application because it was running on some older hardware. I'm like, cool, we'll get them on a newer platform. And then we hit a problem where like some report building thing was just failing out on this new infrastructure, and we didn't have the time and the budget at the time with our client to really like dig that much deeper. So the whole thing got put on hold because of like the application wouldn't work in the newer technology in the newer platform. And we were just like, well, and the one thought was like, well, maybe we just need to throw way more processing power at it and it'll just magically work. But that didn't fix it either. So we're like, okay, put this thing on hold. We'll come back to it. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, it's been like a year. But these types of problems, so we have that kind of technical debt where we're optimistically thinking we're going to get something done, and then something unexpected pops up and derails things for far too long.
Yeah, I mean it's hard too. It's like I think one other thing that I've learned that when in thinking about this is like you can't really make as many positive assumptions. Like when it comes to infrastructure, like, oh, it's totally going to work because it's like this thing. Of course, like, this OS is better. It's got, or this the way that this thing is built, and that we built this thing or we've scripted this thing out. It's totally gonna, like, it works faster for X other thing. Like it's gonna work faster. It's gonna be better for Y, without actually spending some time on that. Like it's not safe to make assumptions in either direction, positive or negative. You have to verify that, or it's gonna kind of bite you sometimes. Sometimes those positive assumptions work out, and then you get you get confirmation bias, right? Well, we've done it for these other applications. It's totally gonna work for this other thing, and then it ends up not being the case, and you kind of end up having to like pick up the pieces at that point.
And in this example, that's exactly what happened. We're like, oh, we're going to move this client to the same infrastructure we're using all of our other clients, and everything's going to be great. And it didn't quite work out that way. So I'm curious, are there any data metrics that you find valuable to track in regards to like the health of your infrastructure or software delivery cycle with your team?
I mean, at least in terms of the delivery cycle, at least like, if I see any parts of the code that start to rot, I think that's one of those things where like, do we assess like, are the use cases for this changing? Are the use cases for this bit of infrastructure? Are the use cases for this particular application or service changing? If something there hasn't been changed. So that's one thing. If I notice a segment of code is not getting as much attention, I think it's, to me, it's always worth sort of examining. Is it worth continuing to hang on to this? Is it useful in the same way? Are people getting their needs met? Using something else, doing something else? Is a change in workflow enough to deprecate a particular bit of something? That's probably the first thing that comes to mind.
Nice. I'm curious also, is there an industry trend that you've found yourself feeling skeptical about?
I mean, I would say probably Web3, just generally incredibly skeptical about it. I think just generally in the industry, we've developed this approach of like attempting to solve human problems with technology. And there are just certain human problems that can't be solved with technology. Like, deep inequities in terms of compensation for specific types of labor. Throwing a technology on top of that doesn't necessarily end up solving the problem. And I think specifically about NFTs, right? Like, I would love it if we saw an era in which starving artists were not a thing, right? That people got fairly compensated for the bits of art they create, the things that they do, because, art to me is a necessary part of life. It's a necessary way of appreciating the world, or thinking, or looking at the world, or experiencing the world through, via a different perspective or a different medium. And, people who serve humanity in that way, deserve to have their needs met as much as, their sort of material needs met as much as folks who are doing other things, right? Or at least in my opinion. I don't see NFTs as a way of fully leveling that playing field. And so that is why I'm still sort of deeply skeptical about at least that aspect of it as a way for people to at least have some more material like compensation for the work that the type of art they create or the work that they create, because it seems like specific bits of work are being made for the medium as opposed to finding ways to compensate people whose art doesn't necessarily conform to that medium, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's true. Thinking about it from that perspective, it's also, I think if anyone asked this question to me, I would say the same thing. And I've only asked a few guests so far this question, and I think every single person has said that. So I don't know what that says. And I think I agree with you on I think that sometimes maybe because what is it about the tech industry that makes us feel like we can solve so many problems because we're problem solvers, but it's sometimes it's like there's something about it where it feels like it's coming from like a little bit of a ignorant perspective, I think, in some ways, or there's another cynical part of me. I'm like, someone else is being very opportunistic here, and I'm just not going to get pulled into the mess there. But it's hard not to be curious about it at the same time. I'm like, what's going on over here? What are these people talking about? Right? But
yeah, I mean, I definitely like looked in just so I could I want to have an understanding of it as well, and I'm like probably the person in my family is probably the most involved in tech. Like, the only, person for, in both my immediate and extended family who's working in the industry. And so, people come to me with questions about it, right? Like, should I buy this NFT? Like that kind of thing. And so I at least wanted to make sure that I could give people an educated, sort of opinion about, any of the emerging technologies. But I also feel like it's important to just just in general, when it comes to I think the question is the same, whether we're talking about Web3 or any other, sort of standard or new type of, or any sort of technology. What are we solving for? What are the problems that we're solving for? And am I building something that is actually best equipped to solve this problem? If the answer is no, then maybe we shouldn't do it. And I think that a lot of the times, I think the inclination, at least right now, it seems like the motivation, or people are getting compensated for doing this, for diving in and just attempting to solve the problem first without examining whether or not this is actually the best way for that problem to be solved. I think too about autonomous vehicles, and it's wouldn't pouring more money into mass transit possibly be a better way to offset that? Sort of the pouring into sort of autonomous operating vehicles. If we poured more into mass transit infrastructure and broad accessibility for that, we might make greater sort of societal gains there around that than worrying about single vehicles that are, that could operate without a driver. So
that's true. It's why do we all need to be so independent and in our little family units or whatever they perceive? We have an interesting culture here. I'll give it that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, a couple of quick last questions for you, Courtney. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers on a regular basis, or most often?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say most often, and especially to folks who are either dabbling in management, or they found themselves sort of relating to other, even just sort of higher level sort of technical leads, and people who are spending a higher proportion of their jobs relating more to people than they are spending touching keyboards. I would say the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. I use that as sort of a counter to approaches on sort of the leaning in philosophy, in terms of, instead of attempting to make people conform to thinking about people as needing to conform to operate inside of a specific system, I try to think about ways in which we can make, at least for me, make my worldview, the sphere of sort of influence I have as someone who is in sort of engineering leadership, be one that is welcoming and incorporating and considerate of all, a diversity of types of people and perspectives, and understanding what they can bring to the table, and thinking about, the systems and groups of people as sort of an evolving set of systems and evolution, and that has sort of informed my worldview a lot about sort of meeting people where they are and sort of having a trauma informed, so to speak, you know, a trauma aware, trauma informed sort of perspective. Like people are coming into this field from a variety of different, backgrounds. And if we're gonna really make the best software that helps a maximum number of people, then we have to have a variety of types of people building it, interacting with it, and thinking about how those folks can fit in as a whole, and understanding their perspective and the gifts that they are coming to us with, to me has been very, very informative. And my philosophy on management has been very much sort of informed by that, even though it doesn't really take management specifically into account. It's not like a book on management. It's not a book on technology at all. It's more based in the tenets of Afrofuturism, actually, than anything else. But it's very, very thinking about how you interact with people and how you move through the world, and sort of ways in which we can reduce doing harm and work in a collective good, is sort of the something that I hope to sort of bring to the table when it comes to or I try to bring to the table when it comes to my thought on sort of being an engineering leader.
That's great. I'm gonna definitely include a link to that book in the show notes for everybody. Very curious. That sounds like really quite the review you have there of it. And so, yeah, thanks for that. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations on software engineering online?
So I'm extremely online for better or for worse. So at CJ Wilburn, CJWIL, B as in boy, URN, on pretty much every social medium that exists. I have occasionally toyed with blogging off and on. So I usually will post links to some of the stuff that I've posted, via another social medium if I have something up on my own personal blog, if I have some a longer screed or set of opinions on something or other there. So you can just catch me at CJ Wilburn on all the things.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Courtney. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop.
Thanks. It's been a joy. I've really enjoyed this conversation so much. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.